crush your enemies.
They drew first blood, not me.
See them driven before you.
Oh, my user.
And hear the lamentation of your women.
But I pity the fool.
Glitter in the dark near the 10-house gate.
Phone home.
They're here.
Oh, real light sleeper, child.
Welcome to Vintage Video, where we're rewatching the 80s so you don't have to. We'll be reviewing every major film release of the 1980s in chronological order, overanalyzing what you've seen and spoiling what you haven't. I'm Patrick O'Reilly.
I'm Jesse Bayless.
And I'm Richard Wells.
And today we're discussing Deathtrap.
Deathtrap.
Released March 19th, 1982, it was written by Presson Allen, based on the stage play by Ira Levin, directed by Sidney Lumet, and released by Warner Brothers. Adam Pally was born one day earlier. He was 1 day old at the theater watching this. On February 26th, 1978, Ira Levin's murder mystery play Deathtrap opened on Broadway and was an instant hit. Warner Brothers reached out within the first year to acquire the film rights for an at-the-time record sum of $1 million for a non-musical play, and agreeing to the condition that the film could not be released within 4 years of the show's first opening to avoid hurting the stage play's ticket sales.
So this movie obviously has a lot of layers to it.
Right.
Did the stage play have exactly one less layer to it that the movie added in terms of the film aspect of it?
We'll dig into what the differences are between the play and the movie.
Okay.
Unexpectedly, the play was so successful that it was still being performed 4 years later and was expected to end its run when the film's release actually drove ticket sales up, leading to a 6-month extension at the Biltmore, wrapping with an unprecedented 1,793 performances. The play was nominated for 4 Tonys for Best Play, Best Direction for Robert Moore, Best Featured Actor for Victor Garber as Clifford Anderson, and Best Featured Actress for Marion Seldes. Over the course of its run, the Sidney character was portrayed first by John Wood, and later actors we've seen in films for the show like Stacy Keach and Farley Granger.
I don't feel like Stacy Keach fits that role, but maybe.
The Michael Caine one?
Oh, yeah, John Wood obviously does.
Yeah. Levin was brought on to adapt his own story to the screen, and at first, Jack Lemmon and Anne Bancroft were set to star as the husband and wife leads Sidney and Myra. Dustin Hoffman was briefly in negotiations about the Clifford role. Burt Reynolds was at one point interested enough in starring that he mistakenly announced an intention to acquire the film rights 2 years after Warner Brothers had already locked them down. Actor Christopher Reeve was between Supermans 2 and 3 when he was offered the part and made some effort to talk the studio into excising the homosexual elements of the story before ultimately accepting it. After Reeve was attached, Michael Caine and Dyan Cannon soon followed based on their previous murder mystery turns in Sleuth and The Last of Sheila respectively. Director Sidney Lumet was considered after his successful film adaptations of stage play 12 Angry Men and Agatha Christie murder mystery Murder on the Orient Express. Presson Allen, director Lumet's regular writer at the time, was attached for a polish of Levin's draft, but neither Levin nor Allen were totally satisfied with what Lumet made of their efforts. The film makes a few major changes from the play, starting with bookending the former one-set story with short theater scenes, but the most controversial change was the inclusion of a romantic kiss between male characters not found in the stage play.
Was the homosexual plot part of it?
Okay. Yeah, but they didn't have a blatant kiss on stage.
I suppose that probably hadn't been done at the time.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it seems like it must have, but in this particular case, it didn't. Not unlike what we discussed in our review of earlier 1982 title Making Love, audiences were reportedly disgusted by the kiss, shouting at the screen and in some cases walking out. Reeve blamed a Time magazine review, which mentioned the kiss, for spoiling a plot twist and costing the film perhaps another $10 million in box office winnings. The MPAA inexplicably dealt the film an R rating, which was appealed and downgraded to a PG.
Is it an R rating because of the violence or the kissing?
I don't know. You have to ask them. Bunch of prudes. A budget of $10.5 million was announced shortly before production began, but in the end, the film was scraped together with a mere $500,000 and went on to reap $19 million in the box office. When it played on television, the kissing scene was always lifted out of the broadcast, and all that remains of the gay subplot is a longing stare and a touch of the face.
Really?
Yeah.
Seems like such a silly thing to do.
It's TV. People will literally cancel their cable if they have to accept things exist in the world. Klaus Van Bülow, a financial backer of both the play and film adaptation of Deathtrap, was convicted soon after the film's release for multiple murder attempts against his wife, Sonny Von Bülow.
Really?
First for an allegedly intentional insulin overdose, which landed her in the hospital, and then for a second overdose months later, which left her in a vegetative state for the rest of her life.
So his role was just, like, financial in this?
Yes.
That's hilarious. He's like, you know what, I'm going to invest in this because I really feel connected to the story.
Right, exactly. He was initially sentenced to 30 years in prison, but hired legendary monster defender Alan Dershowitz, whose clients include O.J. Simpson, Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, and Donald Trump, and on appeal, Von Barlow was exonerated for both attempts when the defense persuaded a jury that Sonny's injuries were likely self-inflicted, citing recent provable behavioral changes as indicators of her general instability. At the 63rd Annual Academy Awards, Jeremy Irons would win Best Actor for his portrayal of Von Bülow opposite Glenn Close as his ill-fated wife Sonny in Barbet Schroeder's 1990 film Reversal of Fortune. Bizarrely, Klaus and Sonny Baudelaire, the younger siblings of Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events, are actually named after the defendant and victim of this high-profile murder case.
Oh, no kidding.
Very strange. In 2005, Frank Pearson, the screenwriter of Cool Hand Luke and Lumet's Dog Day Afternoon, announced an intention to remake the film, but that obviously hasn't happened, and Pearson passed away more than a decade ago now.
I feel like this could hit a resurgence with, like, the Knives Out sort of popularity.
For sure.
Recently.
There's so much Knives Out in this movie already.
Yeah.
The wall of weapons and whatnot. The film opens on a cabin wall decorated with various weapons spanning centuries of origin. Maces, swords, daggers, axes, machetes, and even guns. The classical score resembles a bouncy Masterpiece Theater theme, with credits punching over the picture in a typewriter font. We get closer inserts of individual weapons from the collection, and then cut out of the cabin to a man in all white leaning suspiciously around the corner of a brick wall. Behind him is an illuminated sign pointing out a stage door. In a reverse angle, Michael Caine as Sidney Bruhl watches the man in silence, half obscured by a hanging curtain. The occasional murmurs of an audience are audible over the scene, and when the man thinks the coast is clear, he carries an unconscious or dead showgirl down the steps from the stage door to a garbage can in the alley. At the back of the theater, the show's producer can be seen pacing nervously with his face in his hands. The presumed killer stuffs the girl completely into a barrel and puts a cap on it.
I was trying to think of a. Do you recall the last time we had a body in a garbage can?
Oh, yeah. It was in the alleyway in...
Cutter's Way?
Yeah.
I was going to say Cutter's Way. Yeah, that seems right.
And what should have been a laugh line is met with audible criticism from the audience.
Cooperative as ever, Abigail.
It's the worst play I've ever seen.
I can't believe Sidney Bruhl wrote it.
You would say that out loud in a silent theater on opening night?
Mm-hmm. Hope you can hear me.
Yeah. The man in white runs back up the steps through the stage door just as Sidney comes racing out of the Music Box Theater in Midtown Manhattan. He marches straight into Cafe Ziegfeld next door. The maitre d' recognizes Sidney and hands him a phone when he gestures for it. We cut back to the cabin and a nightstand crowded with pill bottles and cigarette butts. A woman reaches into frame, Sidney's wife Myra, played by Dyan Cannon, and as soon as she takes one of the pills, she is shocked by the sudden ringing of the phone on her bed. In her most abrasive possible voice, she asks how the show went, and we do that thing where the person repeats everything the other person says so we can hear both halves of the call without having to hear both halves of the call.
What do you mean it's a disaster?
What could that possibly mean? We had split screen technology. Just show both halves. Or at least play the audio, please. This is never not weird. Sidney explains that either the audience can't tell it's a comedy or they just don't think it's funny, but either way they aren't laughing. We cut back to the stage as the killer in a fully white tuxedo and top hat is clicked into a pair of handcuffs.
God, who could ever have believed it would end this way? Who? Who?
He directs the last word to the audience, and a polite applause coincides with the curtain falling. The deep-voiced producer, Seymour Starger, stands with Sidney in the back row and lists all the ways Sidney's awful play will ruin him, including his marriage, since his wife told him the show was no good.
Even my goddamn wife. As she told me, she said, you produce another crock by that putt Sidney, you deserve to go broke. Even my goddamn wife.
She should know, Seymour. It's her money.
Putts.
While Sidney gets sloshed at the bar, the bartender assures him that audiences are morons, but the critics will love it. Then he takes an insane swing by flicking on the TV above the bar and tuning into late-night theater reviews, which feature cameos from famous critics, Stuart Klein, Jeffrey Lyons, and Joel Siegel as themselves, predictably dumping on the play entitled Murder Most Fair.
I love that the play that they just saw and walked out of at the end is already being reviewed by several different news stations.
He could have been there for an hour or two.
Well, theater lovers, there is bad news tonight. Bad sets, bad costumes, bad direction, bad actors, and from playwright Sidney Bruhl, a spectacularly bad play.
Do you guys recall the last time we heard a stage performance so viciously lambasted by a television personality in a film that featured Irene Worth?
I do, but it was one of those news anchor movies.
News anchor was a major character in the film.
Eyewitness? No, it wasn't.
That was it.
Was it Eyewitness?
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
Oh my gosh.
The musical is called Robin, Robin being Robin Hood. And if you think the Knicks are incompetent, you should see these merry men. In the great tradition of taking from the rich and giving to the poor, the producers of Robin did likewise. They took from their rich backers and gave to the poor. The poor in this case are the lyricist, very poor, the book writer, extremely poor, and the poorest of them all, the composer. The cast, like the Sherwood Forest, were made of solid cardboard. The orchestra wisely stayed in the pits, where the whole show belonged.
We cut back to the cabin and the tear-streaked face of Myra struggling hopelessly to cheer Sidney up.
Well, they weren't real raves, Sidney, but they certainly weren't what I call bad.
I'm doing the only sensible thing. I'm getting pissed. And I'll see you in East Hampton in the morning.
True to his word, we see him stumble onto the train the next morning, but he rides it much further than intended. He disembarks in Montauk and takes a taxi to the charming cabin with an attached windmill. The $52 cab fare equates to around $170 in today bucks. The exteriors of the property are a real building, the 1885 Edward DeRose Windmill Cottage in East Hampton, New York, which sold for $11.9 million in 2017
Oh my God.
to its current resident, Robert Downey Jr.
Oh, really?
This is his primary residence. He lives in this house.
That's crazy.
Sidney sets a bag down at the desk in the middle of the weapon nook and pours himself a drink.
Weapon nook.
That's what I would call it.
Instead of a breakfast nook.
Yeah. Impossibly, Myra doesn't notice him enter and screams at the sight of him, causing him to drop his freshly made beverage.
Every time I come in this bloody house, you scream!
He shouts at her all the complaints he's saved up from last night, and then complains that he had to take a taxi like a disgusting poor person because he can't afford a limo anymore.
I can, and everything I have is yours, you know.
Don't you understand? I want to pay for my own bloody limousines!
Around the cabin, we see one-sheets for earlier, more successful Sidney Bruhl plays, like In for the Kill and Hell's Teeth. Sidney worries aloud that he's all written out and can't even be trusted to make it home to her anymore. He confesses he passed out on the train and wrote it to the last stop in Montauk by mistake. Myra gratingly screams compliments in his face.
You're a darling, you're a wonderful, wonderful writer. You are just going through a streak of bad luck.
And...
To add insult to injury, he received a script entitled Deathtrap in the mail yesterday, written by Clifford Anderson, a former student that puts all his recent work to shame.
A thriller in 2 acts, 1 set, 5 characters. A juicy murder in Act 1, terror in Act 2. An ironic and astonishing resolution. Good dialogue, laughs in all the right places. Very, very commercial and easy to cast.
Which could just as easily describe Ira Levin's stage version of this story, but for the film adaptations, Sidney Lumet bookends it with scenes that take place outside of the cabin, which playwright Levin has expressed intense disappointment with. Clifford sent along the script hoping for notes from his former instructor and mentions specifically that Sidney will be the first to read it. Sidney struggles to put a face to the name, but seems to recall Clifford as being a big fat kid. But when we meet Clifford, it's clear Sidney was confused. Or at least, he's acting confused. Myra thinks Sidney must be exaggerating how good it is.
A first attempt by a total amateur?
I'll tell you how good that is. Even a gifted director couldn't hurt it.
We cut upstairs to the master bedroom, and wider now we can see wooden gears in the ceiling, suggesting this room is situated directly under the attached windmill.
Yeah, I was just like, I assumed it was maybe locked down in some kind of way, but we'll see later.
It's actually spinning around.
Yeah, that it actually moves. That would freak me out in the middle of the night. Almost like, especially because,
it's creaking the whole time, too. I could not sleep under this.
Yeah, well, and also, you get windy and stormy days in a place like that.
Well, if it has full free rotation, then if there's like sails on these, arms of the windmill, like it would just be fully turning a lot of the time, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that like cause like
Wear
dust and dirt to fall on your bed and stuff?
Yeah. Or you stand up and catch your hair in it. Sidney raises the pile of cigarette butts, and she reminds him how panicked she was to miss the show tonight. He pleads with her not to smoke since she's already on so many medications for her anxiety. She tucks Sidney into bed and then crawls in next to him. She tries to put his arm over her, but Sidney hides under the covers to escape. After a second sober read of Clifford's play in the morning, Sidney confirms it's perfection. He jokes with Myra that he should just murder this Clifford kid and sell the play as his own work, since nobody else has seen it yet, and they both laugh. Myra suggests that Sidney might take a swing at producing the play, since he is well connected in that world.
Yeah, that was my first thought. I was just like...
It's an obvious choice.
Yeah, well, just produce it or direct it.
Darling, though I might be capable of killing Clifford Anderson, I am not up to the criminal behavior of a Broadway producer.
I dare say not.
Next, she suggests a collaboration, and Sidney jokes he doesn't need help murdering people. Sidney admits to a shaken confidence in his abilities as a writer, and Myra reminds him that his play, The Murder Game, is the longest-running thriller in Broadway history, an honor which actually belongs to Ira Levin's Deathtrap stage play, with nearly 1,800 performances. The Murder Game, by the way, was an actual film in 1965, directed by a Sidney, Salco, not Bruhl, and even features among the cast a young Dyan Caine. Also worth mentioning that the title Deathtrap itself is likely an intentional reference to Agatha Christie's own play, The Mousetrap, which is the longest-running murder mystery play of all time, having opened in 1952, and is still actively running today with nearly 30,000 performances.
That's crazy.
It paused a little bit for COVID,
Yeah.
so it's not continuous anymore, but as of 2020, it was continuous from 52.
Nothing's continuous anymore.
Somehow he interprets her praise as an admission of disappointment at who Sidney has become.
Oh well. Nothing recedes like success.
She pleads with Sidney to call Clifford and shoots down a few of his suggested murder weapons. She also mentions a psychic neighbor character named Helga Dorp, who would quickly sniff out the psychic vibrations of a murder in their cabin.
And I like, after all the stuff she says about the psychic, he actually goes, well, that does give one pause. He's just like, oh, I hadn't considered a psychic. This might complicate things.
Definitely worth worrying about. Apparently, she is a celebrity psychic with a major book deal, and she's renting the place next door with part of her advance. Myra swears by Tendorp's abilities, citing multiple displays of her powers at a recent dinner party, including finding a set of keys under the dryer that had been missing for 40 years. Over breakfast, it occurs to Sidney that he has his students mixed up and Clifford wasn't the fat one at all. Myra assures him that working with the student will help him get his groove back. He returns repeatedly to the joke option of murdering Clifford, and his convincing tone starts to disturb Myra.
Sidney, what's the matter with you? Oh my God. Oh my God, you did have a bad night, didn't you? I think that you're thinking that after last night you actually would kill to have another hit play.
Do you know what this play would net its author in today's market? Between $3 and $5 million. And that is without the Deathtrap t-shirts.
Sidney stands to comply with Myra's suggestion. He calls Clifford and compliments a solid first draft. Again, we can guess everything Clifford says from Sidney's responses. In this case, he confesses that he too thought his masterwork was perfect in the first draft, but his mentor, George S. Kaufman, convinced him otherwise and saved the play, refusing any credit for his work. Kaufman, of course, being a real playwright, responsible for several Marx Brothers musicals, and winner of Pulitzer Prizes for his work on Of Thee I Sing and You Can't Take It With You. He also won a Tony in 1951 for directing the original Broadway run of Guys and Dolls.
So they do a really interesting shot here that I wish they would have stuck with. Michael Caine is walking with the phone to his ear, and he's walking in a circle, and the camera's rotating around with him, but then they occasionally cut to Dyan Caine for reactions.
Just reacting to it, yeah.
And come back to him. It's like, I wish it just would have stayed with him, the camera rotating around constantly, the whole conversation, uncut, just keep walking around in a circle. It would have been great.
Maybe that was the intent and they just couldn't get it in one take.
Too technical to keep going in circles, maybe.
Sidney confirms with Clifford that nobody else has read the play, and Clifford admits further that nobody even knows he's been writing it. Sidney lies that he's been working on a play based on their Dutch psychic neighbor Helga ten Dorp. He looks to Myra for a title suggestion, but she doesn't give him anything to work with.
It's called The Frowning Wife.
Since Clifford is so close, just an hour down the road in Quogue, he should join them for dinner tonight. Sidney recommends the train, offering to pick Clifford up at the East Hampton station.
No one else has read it. No one else even knows he's working on it. He's house-sitting for a couple who are in Europe, and he is unmarried. His car is in the garage for repairs.
So, no one will see you picking him up.
I can't tell if Myra is laughing because she thinks he's joking or because she's come around to the plan.
Yeah, there's a couple of moments where I'm not sure if Myra is maybe on board.
Right. Later that night, we see Sidney pull up to the station, and Clifford, played by Christopher Reeve, hops in the car with the script in a manila envelope under his arm. He brings Clifford back to the cabin, and the young playwright is fascinated with Sidney's weapon collection. One of the blades on the wall is a real knife from his biggest hit, The Murder Game. Sidney explains it was replaced with a prop weapon for the second act, but had to be real at the start.
Did it have to be real?
I can't imagine it had to be real. Like, we did have to murder one real person for this play.
That's why it had a very short run.
Yeah. Panning around the collection, we can see additional one-sheet posters for Blind Justice and Mace. Myra asks what took them so long, and Sidney claims he had errands to run along the way. Sidney turns to Myra behind Clifford's back and gestures, crossing his heart with a finger. I'm not sure what that was meant to communicate. Clifford spots an older poster for a play called Gunpoint and admits it was the first play he ever saw.
Gunpoint? Do you know that Gunpoint is the first play that I ever saw? I was 12 years old.
Young man, if you're trying to depress me, you're right on target.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, but really, that's how I got hooked on thrillers.
Panning slightly further to the right, we see two more posters in the room, Flicker of Doubt and Murderer's Child. Presumably all of these are Sidney Bruhl scripts. Sidney claims Angel Street is what got him into thrillers, and he and Clifford recite a line of dialogue from the play in unison.
Bella, where is that grocery bill? What have you done with it, you poor, wretched creature?
I was 15.
Angel Street was the retitled Broadway run of Patrick Hamilton's 1938 play Gaslight, from which the verb to gaslight originates, and which was later adapted into the 1944 George Cukor film.
You keep saying that, but I don't think it's true.
I have never said that before. I don't know what you're talking about. Myra doesn't envy their obsession, and Sidney claims that it's all in the pursuit of money anyway. Clifford thinks he's not in it for the money, and Sidney reminds him he's just getting started. Myra fetches both men drinks as they crack open their copies of the script. As she hands Sidney a glass, we can see two more posters on the wall behind her. One is called A Hint of Murder, and the other is behind her and illegible. Though my guess would be it's The Murder Game, since that's the only one that we know the title of that we haven't seen a poster for. As they start to dig into the script and share their thoughts on possible improvements, Myra watches them both very closely. They share a toast to the script, and Myra joins enthusiastically as if to convince Sidney against his plan by reminding him the play could make much more than enough for them to split.
Deathtrap. Deathtrap.
Deathtrap! And it'll be toasted with more than ginger ale someday if Sidney's right about it, and I'm sure that he is.
Sidney asks Myra for some privacy, and she moves 6 feet away to a different chair where she can still keep an eye on the proceedings. Sidney was insistent that Clifford bring a second copy so he could move around the cabin without Clifford over his shoulder, but here, Clifford offers his copy to Myra for notes, and Sidney is driven into a rage. In response, Myra launches into another speech about how excited Sidney is to work with Cliff, and they're sure to make a fortune together.
I know! He could improve your play tremendously. He could turn it into a hit that would run for years and years and make more than enough money for everyone concerned.
See, all of this, I thought, this was the plan.
Right.
This is Myra absolutely on board because she's not a good actress.
Yeah.
And so all her line readings are coming off as like
super fake.
Yeah. And I was like, okay, so this is the plan. Like, get them mad, make it seem like they're having fight, and then she makes a passion to plea for them to work together.
Right. When she sees she isn't changing Sidney's mind, she turns back to Clifford and demands Sidney be offered credit on whatever contribution he makes to the script's success. She tells Sidney he should set down his own script to collaborate with Clifford on perfecting Deathtrap.
Put aside the drowning wife.
I thought it was frowning.
Frowning? What sort of title would that be? The Drowning Wife?
When she finishes her speech, Clifford is left in the awkward position of having to accept a co-writer on his script or to turn down the mentorship of a writer he has idolized for decades. Ultimately, Clifford admits that he's confident in his work and would rather get a second opinion to see if Sidney's notes are even necessary before he signs away the rights to his first stage play. He tells them he plans to send copies to agents Sidney had recommended in his seminar and apologizes if he's wasted their time. Myra begs him to reconsider until Sidney loudly interjects that they aren't so desperate that they rely on this collaboration to survive. Sidney talks about how important his own play, The Drowning Wife, is, and he would rather not help Clifford in the first place. He wanders back to the weapon collection, and here we can see the last poster clearly, and it is the murder game. Sidney even takes things a step further by suggesting that he already has an outline for the play after The Drowning Wife, something about the life of Harry Houdini, and so it would truly be a sacrifice for him to commit to rewrites on Deathtrap. Speaking of Houdini, Sidney points to an item on the wall of weapons, a pair of old-fashioned handcuffs, which he claims were purchased from Houdini's own personal collection for $1,300, more than $4,200 today. He entices Clifford to try them on, and Myra can see her time to intervene is running out. Clifford suspects the cuffs are escape-proof, but Sidney assures him they're trick cuffs, and he explains the trick to unbuckling them. Clifford makes little progress. He's instructed to click his wrists together and then twist and yank them apart at the same time, but after several tries, the camera sits in Clifford's lap and slowly cranes up to his face as it dawns on him that he wasn't accidentally locked into these cuffs. He turns to look at Myra, who he finally realizes has been trying to save him all night, and she looks very worried. Clifford informs Sidney that someone will be calling here to check on him shortly. He had plans with a woman tonight around this time and gave her the number of the cabin in case he hadn't shown up. As we cut back and forth to the faces of everyone in the scene, the camera gets closer and closer. Myra and Sidney clearly don't believe this story, especially as Clifford keeps adding details. Sidney claims they changed their number recently, so the number Clifford gave his friend might be out of date. Sidney covers the receiver with their number printed on it and forces Clifford to choose between two phone number options, the old and the new. And it seems Clifford is able to guess correctly between them. Myra shares with Sidney that she can't take much more of this situation. He asks if she's taken her heart meds, and she hasn't. Sidney scours the weapon wall and locates the keys to the handcuffs. Clifford is obviously relieved, but struggles with the key to free himself, and Sidney sneaks around behind him with a chain to begin choking the man. Clifford falls out of his chair to the ground as Sidney pulls the chain tight against his neck, drawing blood. Myra loses her shit when she sees what's happening and runs screaming through the room with her arms in the air.
Kermit the Frog style.
Right? I'm convinced this one shot of her raising her hands over her head is what earned her the Razzie nomination this year, because the rest of her performance is fine. It's just a cartoonish panic run that they really should have shot over again. Eventually, Sidney chokes the life out of the young playwright and then rushes to the bar to take a big swig of alcohol. He removes the chain that he choked Clifford with and wipes it down with a handkerchief, and then tosses the handkerchief in the fireplace. Definitely still blood on this chain, though. You can just wipe a chain and be like, there, clean. Myra seems convinced they're doomed to prison, but Sidney assures her that no one will think twice about an artist disappearing from a house-sitting job. He tosses Clifford's copy of the play in the fireplace and shouts at Myra to help him carry Clifford's body wrapped in a carpet. Later, Sidney discusses the plan moving forward in the kitchen with Myra, but she's barely responding. It seems she has settled on a plan of divorce since she doesn't recognize Sidney as the man she married. She thinks the police will catch him and points out that whoever at the theater accepted the package with Sidney's copy of Deathtrap might have seen Clifford's name on the envelope. Myra talks about how they'll divide their assets when they separate. Suddenly, there's a ring at the doorbell, and at first Myra assumes it's the police somehow, and then switches her guess.
Probably Helga Dorp and her famous pointing finger.
Turns out Myra got it right on her second try, and this is where the film loses me for a while. Sidney leaves the kitchen to answer the door, but Helga Dorp sneaks in the back door through the kitchen after waiting too long for a response. She catches Myra off guard.
Dear neighbor, it's only me. I am your neighbor from the house of Persky.
Helga speaks with a very thick Dutch accent, and without subtitles I would have a hard time understanding most of it. She's wearing reflective clothing and a hat with reflective road studs so that she isn't hit by cars when she jogs at night. Inexplicably, they invite her into their home and show unrealistic patience as she wanders around the cottage following vague energies through the living room. There's no reason they would let this woman in. There's no reason they would let this woman wander all around their house unsupervised. It's just an extremely unbelievable scene, and the film would lose literally nothing by removing the Helga ten Dorp character. She's basically serving the purpose of a suspicious detective character, but with the convenient difference of not having to be called to the scene by anyone. Magic brought her here, and she doesn't even have to use clever clues or deduction because magic just tells her things. When Sidney introduces Helga to Myra, she senses a cluster of phantom pain around Myra's heart, but Myra claims to be fine. She intuits via powers that Sidney was about to offer her a drink and preemptively turns it down. It's also deductive reasoning. I feel like that's a thing people do.
You can offer her a drink.
It seems like the only reason she's here is because Sidney keeps talking about the perfect murder mystery being a 5-character story, but 2 of the 5 in this film aren't entirely necessary. Maybe 3 of the 5. Helga wanders around the house using her magical powers to follow a trail of pain to the weapon nook. She pulls a sharp dagger off the wall and says it was used many times by a beautiful woman, but always pretending. She predicts it will be used again in the future by another woman, not in a play but because of one. Sidney tries to assure her that the death she senses in this room is the death of a character in a play and nothing real. Grasping for details from the ether, Helga asks if the play involves a black character named Smith Colonna, but neither Sidney nor Myra recognize the name.
So I immediately had misheard her saying Smith Corona.
Oh, okay.
And I was like, how have you not heard of Smith Corona?
Yeah, you're a playwright. That's crazy.
Because of her accent, because of how thick it was. I was like, she just said Smith Corona. You should know what it is.
They just stand there like idiots while a psychic wanders around their house spouting nonsense for way too long.
Remember what else I tell you. Dagger is used again by woman because of play. Or the man in boots attacks you. Of these 2 things, I'm certain. All else is confusing.
Sidney asks if she would like that drink now, inexplicably inviting her to stay longer, but she insists she must go. On the way out, for no reason, she guesses what Myra's childhood home looked like. Myra claims she's correct, but never confirms it with Sidney after she's gone. Myra and Sidney retire to bed, and the gears in their bedroom ceiling turn with the windmill. She heads back downstairs to get them a drink to relax, and frightens herself with noises. She runs back to bed to hide under the blankets, but Sidney drags her back downstairs to prove she's imagining anything she heard. He opens the double doors to the deck off the house, and at first she screams, but eventually admits there was nothing to be afraid of. They share a bit of brandy, and Myra relaxes enough to laugh at her own paranoia. She admits, hesitantly, that a small evil part of her hoped that he would go through with his murder plan, and it excited her in the moment. He assures her, in case she was feeling any guilt, that she tried to stop him several times, and the murder was entirely his doing. They head to bed together, and Sidney asks her to open the window, but when she gets there, Clifford bursts back into the house covered in blood and mud, with a small log in his hand. The score leaps into a maniacal calliope piece. Sidney rises from the bed to fight him off, but Clifford bashes him repeatedly in the head and chest, knocking him to the floor. Clifford chases Myra back down the stairs into the den, where her breathing grows ragged and she grasps at her neck for a moment before collapsing to the floor. He creeps up to her on the floor and kneels beside her to check for signs of life, and basically confirms for us that this won't be another switcheroo situation later.
Yeah, he even brings the old mirror up to the nose trick.
Sidney strolls up behind him, looking down at Myra, and Clifford's lack of surprise tells us that they're in cahoots.
It worked. She's dead. Yes, of course. She's had minor heart attacks over much less. For future reference, Clifford, that styrofoam log hurts. Sorry.
I love the implication they might use this styrofoam log again for a future murder plot. Clifford admits how worried he was listening in from outside on the psychic reading the energies of the room. Sidney says it actually works in their favor that someone visited them tonight because he's been telling people she was under the weather, and now he'll have Helga's corroboration that there was some excitement in the house that night. Sidney laments again that his play didn't do better because with a guaranteed income stream, they could have left town immediately.
Sidney laments.
Sidney laments. Sidney says he's going to wait a bit before he calls an ambulance.
Also, we don't want anyone working miracles of resuscitation, do we?
Sidney remembers something and returns to the living room to toss the surviving copy of Deathtrap into the fireplace, which Clifford points out isn't necessary, but we learn here that Deathtrap the play doesn't actually exist. It was just a MacGuffin for their murder plot. It's a good thing Myra didn't read too much of whatever they handed her.
Yeah.
Was it just a blank script, or was it like a crappy script?
Yeah, I imagine they had written like something or had pages for...
I mean, she doesn't seem like she's supposed to be an idiot character. She probably could have read it and been like, this is bad. Why did you think this was a great script?
Well, but even if they had written it, they would be writing what's happening, and what's happening would include the death of the wife, so you really wouldn't want her to get that far.
You definitely don't want it to be the eventual Deathtrap script.
Farewell, Deathtrap. Would that you were the genuine article.
In the process of cleaning off the mud and fake blood, Clifford is suddenly shirtless, and Sidney lays a hand on his chest and orders him upstairs.
Do a quick wash up. Get into bed. And stay there. How about that?
Clifford leans in for a tame by today's standards kiss that would prove quite controversial at the time, and both actors have said they needed to get thoroughly intoxicated to even do the scene, which I think is just something actors had to say at the time to avoid being accused of actually being secretly gay, because these are both professional actors, and nobody expects them to be in love with every other actor they kiss. That doesn't make sense. Clifford heads upstairs, and Sidney sits down and starts sobbing as he prepares to phone emergency services.
Could you please send an ambulance as quickly as possible? My wife has had a coronary. Please, come immediately. Thank you. Goodbye.
We cut right to Myra's funeral, and then dissolve back to the cabin where Clifford works feverishly at a typewriter. Across the desk, Sidney stares idly at his own typewriter. Sidney wonders aloud how Clifford is making such quick progress, and he explains that the characters are so fully formed in his head that they write the story for him. Clifford claims he's done with thrillers, so he doesn't have to line with intricate clues to power the story. Sidney goes to lay on the couch, and Clifford suggests a visit from Dorp might inspire him, but he's not interested. The doorbell rings, and when Sidney answers, it's Henry Jones as Porter Milgrim, Sidney's friend, in quotes.
How do you do, sir?
How do you do?
Nice
I would say my attorney, but he'd bill me.
Well, I'm going to bill you anyway. It's a business call.
He introduces Porter to his secretary, Clifford. Sidney steps away to get some cash so Clifford can go shopping, and while they're alone together, Clifford tells Porter that Sidney was a wreck last week mourning Myra, but he's doing better lately. When Clifford is gone, Sidney shares a suspicion that his new secretary might be gay, but he couldn't care less. He just didn't like the optics of hiring a young female secretary so soon after his wife's passing. Porter tells Sidney that people have tried to call, but Clifford has been turning them all away, suggesting he's buried himself in his work. They go for a quick walk, and Porter presents Sidney with some paperwork regarding the potential fortune he'll inherit from Myra.
I had no idea there was this much.
Back in the cottage later, Porter asks about Sidney's writing process and what part Clifford plays. When Sidney explains Clifford has lately been focusing on his own play, Porter warns him to guard his own premise since he noticed Clifford locking his own script in a desk drawer, suggesting there's some reason he doesn't want Sidney to see it. It's clear from his expression that Sidney hadn't considered this and is instantly suspicious.
Then again, maybe he was afraid you'd steal his idea.
As soon as Porter leaves, Sidney makes a beeline for the desk and struggles with the wrong key before trying to pick the drawer lock. He breaks off a letter opener in the narrow slot above the drawer and then takes the sharp dagger off the wall to remove the broken letter opener fragment, and then he pulls his own drawer from the other side of the desk to reach into Clifford's locked drawer from the opposite side, but it's well made and he can't get into it. When he hears Clifford skidding into the driveway, he withdraws a folder and blank paper from his own drawers and takes a seat on the couch to read the morning newspaper. Clifford enters and gets right back to work, pulling out his own script, an identical pile of paper in an identical folder, and setting it beside his typewriter while Sidney puts the groceries away. Sidney calls Clifford into the kitchen, but then sneaks out the back door and in through the porch. He's able to swap Clifford's actual script with his own decoy folder before Clifford can find him.
Where are you?
Sidney reappears, claiming they must have followed each other in a circle just now. He offers Clifford a drink. Sidney immediately pages through Clifford's script right in front of him and remarks angrily on Clifford's claim that he was done with thrillers, and Clifford assures Sidney he'll be inspired to write something soon and not to worry about it. Not getting his point across, Sidney begins reading directly from Clifford's manuscript.
Deathtrap. A thriller in 2 acts by Clifford Anderson.
Realizing he's been swindled, Clifford flips through the blank pages of his own folder and yanks out his desk in search of what Sidney's holding.
How the hell did you... Stage left. A brick fireplace, practical to the extent that paper can be burned in it.
As he continues reading, it's clear Clifford's latest script, with names changed to protect the innocent and guilty, is the actual events of the film thus far. Sidney's obvious issue is that the changes are so minuscule that anyone could easily translate the plot into the true story.
Would you like me to explain?
What, that you're a lunatic with a death wish?
I've got the same wish you have, Sidney, a success wish.
This is not going to bring you success. This, you arsehole, is going to bring you 20 to life in maximum security.
No, Sidney, listen to me. Come on.
Sidney takes his prediction of how this will go to a very dark place.
I hate to ask this, but could you give me your own special definition of success? Being gangbanged in a shower in a state penitentiary?
This whole scene, I do not know how Michael Caine is able to keep that level of shouting that he's doing.
Yeah. He's at that volume the entire time for like 6 minutes screaming. Clifford offers to change a few more details, but he's missing Sidney's entire complaint.
I can make it Bridgehampton, not East Hampton.
Why make it anywhere? Why make it?
Because it's there, Sidney.
That's mountains, not plays.
I love that bit. It reminds me of one of my favorite New Yorker caption contests. I didn't win, but the one that won, I was like, yeah, that should have won. It was a guy in like mountain climbing gear just floating in the air and people watching him like, what the hell is that guy doing? And the caption that they submitted was, because it wasn't there.
Yeah.
I was just like, that's so good. Clifford calmly diffuses him and explains that what happened here was basically already a play, since they rehearsed every step of the plan in advance, and an audience is bound to be just as invigorated watching it unfold on stage.
And what are you going to say to the man from the Times when he asks you, didn't you work for Sidney Bruhl, and didn't his wife have a heart attack at about the same time you came here?
No comment.
Which I guess would work for the press, but if it was a detective, he would probably need a better story than that eventually. He could also just as easily claim he based it on his experience working here, and he doesn't care how tasteless it sounds. Sidney admits that even the inevitable rumors and damage to his reputation would be unacceptable. He patently refuses to allow Clifford to continue writing it.
Why, look, a brick fireplace. I wonder if it is practical to the extent that paper can burn in it.
Stop right where you are, fella.
This is probably my favorite line in the film.
Yeah.
Because it's not only a turn for the character as we've seen him so far, but it feels like a turn for Christopher Reeve's whole career. Because suddenly in the middle of the scene, he went from Superman to calculated maniac.
Yeah.
Even Sidney is terrified.
You burn that and I'll go right out of here and write it someplace else. Now you give it to me.
When Sidney aborts torching the pages, they bring the energy way down. Clifford informs Sidney that not only will he continue writing Deathtrap, they will write it together. The press will have a field day, but it will lead to an undeniable frenzy at the box office.
Sidney, nobody gives a shit who did what or who they did it to. All they want is to be in on it. I mean, you killed your wife? That's okay. Why don't you abuse your kids? Poison a well? Flog bats! As long as you get on television, talk about it afterwards. You know I'm right, don't you?
The line flog bats almost sounds 80-yard, and since I don't understand it at all, I have to assume it was a cover-up line for something they decided was too dark.
Yeah,
or
probably
too gay.
Probably there was probably F something.
And I think the mouth shapes are correct for possibly fuck pets. But maybe I'm in the wrong, and flogging bats is totally a thing that I just have been missing out on. In a disturbing case of life imitating art, while researching the Von Bulow murder case, I found an excerpt from a novel called Taking the Stand, written by Von Bulow's defense attorney Dershowitz, describing a celebratory dinner after the conviction was overturned. Dershowitz alleges that Norman Mailer was in attendance, and when he realized what they were celebrating, he grabbed his wife's arm and said, "Let's get out of here. I think this guy's innocent. I thought we were going to be having dinner with a man who actually tried to kill his wife. This is boring." So the next line in the film seemed oddly prescient.
Sidney, you ever hear of somebody turning down a party where they think they can meet Nixon or Vesco or any one of those big guys that got away with it?
Sidney seems to surrender to Clifford's argument, but starts a new line of questioning about Clifford's origins and his childhood time in juvenile detention and rehabilitation facilities. He wonders aloud if Clifford recalls anyone mentioning the word sociopath.
Isn't that what it's called?
That's what it's called. Does that word frighten you, Sidney?
Oh, no, it doesn't frighten me. It does, however, give me pause. Clinically, it means, as I'm sure you know, it means one who has no sense of moral obligation whatsoever.
Sidney extrapolates the diagnosis on the way to asking if he agrees to collaborate on the play, how could he possibly trust Clifford not to sell him out? These are also questions I would have asked myself before plotting a murder with a sociopath.
Yeah.
Clifford reminds Sidney that as long as he needs Sidney's help, he should be safe from the next murder. He enumerates some problems with the script he's struggled with, and Sidney quickly agrees he could help on that front. He worries that financially he doesn't have much of a choice but to accept, since Myra's will be in probate for 2 years, and he doesn't stand to inherit much anyway. Sidney dips out of the room and returns with a bottle of champagne to celebrate their partnership. They toast again to Deathtrap.
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 And leave a pregnant pause where before Myra had chimed in after them. Sidney makes a few suggestions about Act 1 and offers to handle Act 2 all on his own, which is letting us know that he'll be in charge of what happens in the second half of the film. That night, there's a thunderstorm over the house. Clifford is home alone working on his half of the play when he hears a sound outside, but finds nothing when he leans out the doors. Eventually, he finds Helga at a window looking for Sidney. He informs her Sidney is out, and she passive-aggressively invites herself in.
It's very wet.
Oh, sorry. Why don't you come in?
Okay.
Clifford introduces himself and admits to knowing a little bit about her. Again, she is welcome to wander around the cottage collecting psychic energies. She claims to be here to borrow candles since she foresees a much worse storm later tonight. When Clifford leaves to retrieve candles from upstairs, she notices he's wearing boots and flashes back to when she told Sidney a man in boots would attack him. Just then, Sidney arrives home from a dinner with his attorney, Porter. Privately, she informs Sidney that the man in boots is the one from her earlier vision. She's picking up terrible energies from this place tonight and worries for Sidney's life. Sidney informs her that he planned on firing Clifford tonight, as though it were a fortuitous decision and not definitely what sends Clifford into a murderous rage.
Right?
He's like, oh, that's great, because I was going to fire him, so he definitely won't kill me. Helga is shocked again when she notices Clifford's Smith Corona typewriter.
Smith Corona?
This must be who she meant when she asked earlier about a black person named Smith Colonna. Clifford returns with candles and she takes 2 and heads for the door. She offers to stay, but Sidney tells her it isn't necessary, and as soon as she's gone, Clifford guesses her warning, since he heard the premonition from outside the first time she visited the cottage, and she just remarked on his boots before he went upstairs.
I told her you were giving me karate lessons and we were attacking each other all over the place. The closer you stick to the truth, the better.
Does that mean they've been fucking all over this cabin? Is that his joke?
I think that's probably the message there.
Sidney tells Clifford he has some ideas about the 2 problem areas from Act 1, and he thinks they're worth sorting out right now. But when the storm gets louder, he sends Clifford upstairs to close the windows. While he's out of the room, Sidney creeps to the weapon wall and collects a handgun to hide behind the fireplace mantle across the room. Sidney insists on acting out the scenes as they work on them, a technique he employs in his seminars.
Why?
Don't you remember the seminar? When in doubt, physicalize. Come on.
He poses Clifford ahead of him and charges him, but Clifford is quick to react and gets Sidney in a tight headlock for a moment. They separate, and Sidney thinks this proves the scene could work as written, but he hasn't escaped the exercise unscathed.
Voila. It works.
I scratched your neck.
I'll survive.
Sidney moves on to the next scene that needs work. He instructs Clifford to arm himself with a big battle axe from the collection. He claims it looks wrong in Clifford's hands and advises him to switch arms, but Clifford insists on switching back. All the while, Sidney backs away from him toward the fireplace. He tells Clifford to try setting the weapon down and then withdraws the handgun. Clearly, the hand switching was just to litter the axe with fingerprints to confirm Sidney's planned self-defense alibi. He explains to Clifford that he loaded the gun last night because he refuses to be known as the gay playwright who killed his wife and then wrote about it. If I were going to modernize this play, I would call it If We Did It, as a reference to O.J.'s book, If I Did It, where he described exactly how he would have killed his wife but definitely didn't. Clifford tells Sidney that without this play, he's finished. He can't ride alone, he has nothing coming from Myra's estate, and Clifford is his only chance at surviving. Sidney takes the moment to confess to a much larger inheritance than he admitted before, around $1 million in cash, not counting the property. Further, he shares that over dinner with Porter, he learned more of Clifford's violent background, and it will be no trouble at all to convince anyone that he could fly into a rage upon being let go here. As he points the weapon, Sidney seems stricken with actual guilt. He has no reason to fake this, so I think this is a real emotion he's having.
But it's because it's survival.
Right.
Like, I have to kill him to save myself.
Right.
Oh, God. This is going to be even harder than I expected. Goodbye, Clifford.
Bye, Sidney.
The gun has evidently been unloaded at some point, and after the first 2 clicks, Sidney points it in his own face to test the third shot, but it's no use.
Bang, bang. Sorry if the click is so anticlimactic, Sidney, but I needed the bullets from that gun. For this one. Now sit down, dum-dum. Sit down!
But it's also really easy to see if a gun
right
is loaded.
Even when he says, I fully loaded this gun, and I'm looking down the cylinder, I'm like, no, you didn't.
Yeah,
it's totally empty.
This empty gun.
I feel like you would even feel the weight of it being completely empty.
I mean, I guess if you're not super familiar with the weight of a loaded gun versus an empty gun, but even so, you can clearly see that it's loaded or not.
Now it's Sidney's turn to back away and Clifford's turn to monologue. He tosses Sidney another set of handcuffs from the collection and instructs him to shackle himself to a chair. He thanks Sidney for a brilliant last-minute twist for the play. As far as the bullets, he claims to have heard Sidney clumsily loading the gun last night and simply transferred the rounds in the morning. He pokes fun at how stupid Sidney's been from the beginning, never noticing he was locking up the script until after his lawyer had to point it out. He does, however, express gratitude to Sidney for his contribution of physicalizing scenes as a method to frame someone.
Julian sets Victor up for what will look like a murder in self-defense by getting him to act out bits of business from the play. Oh, God, that's nice, Sidney.
I always think it's funny when writers force their characters to compliment their own brilliance.
I mean, wow, that is simple. It is workable. It's going to play. I'm really in your debt.
Clifford plans to change the story to make his own character a victim of Sidney's character's grooming. In the end, the Sidney stand-in confesses his wrongdoing in the closing monologue and then shoots himself. Sidney thinks that's a shit ending, and he's probably right, even though he's just trying to buy time. Clifford surprises Sidney by admitting he never intended to kill him at all. He'll let him leave, and he'll submit the play on his own, claiming it to be a complete work of fiction, unless Sidney tries to muck it up for him. Lightning crashes, and Clifford compliments the touch.
Electrical effects by God himself.
Reminding us that flash wasn't even lightning, and we're watching a play about a play about a play. Clifford heads upstairs to pack his things, but as soon as he's alone, Sidney pops off the handcuffs and crosses to the weapon gallery to lift the crossbow off the wall. He calls up to Clifford.
Cliff? Cliff? You can come down. Those were Houdini's handcuffs.
Upstairs, Clifford is terrified by this flaw in his plan. He sneaks around the house with his gun at the ready, while Sidney rushes outside to climb the exterior of the house in the rain with his crossbow. I wanted him to just slip and fall and shoot himself in the face, and that's the end of the story. As Clifford slowly creeps down the stairs, we see Sidney climbing into the window of the master bedroom. He loads and readies the crossbow and follows Clifford silently down the steps in his socks, and under the cover of raging thunder, takes aim and fires a bolt into Clifford's back, killing him seemingly instantly. Sidney kneels down to disarm the corpse. He puts both guns back on the wall, hangs up Houdini's cuffs, and then places the same battle axe from his plan in Clifford's hands on the floor. The power goes out, and Sidney looks for matches in the dark, but another voice rings out in the room.
Matches. Candle. I came to help. Such troubles. But not trouble for you. Trouble from you.
Well, strictly speaking, Helga, I'd say we're both in a spot of trouble.
Helga seems to have the whole story figured out and even predicts Sidney's instinct to use the sharp dagger on her. She snatches one of the guns off the weapon wall, and Sidney assures her it's the empty one. She approaches him slowly, not believing his words, but when she steps over Clifford on the floor, he wakes up and grabs her around the ankle, tripping her. When she hits the ground, she loses the gun, and the candle goes out. A flash of lightning illuminates the gun on the floor, and Helga and Sidney both reach for it. Wrestling over the gun and blade simultaneously, they stand together, still fighting over both weapons, and even Clifford manages to get back on his feet. Sidney shouts Helga away from him and prepares to fire the gun at her just as Clifford swings the axe down at him, and in a quick jump cut, all three actors are replaced by different actors in the same situation, still fighting over the blade and gun in flashing lightning. In the end, the new Clifford, Victor, stabs the new Sidney, Julian, in the back, and they collapse in a pile on the floor as Helga backs away from them both. As the camera angle widens, we see the edge of a stage and hear the shock of an audience at the story's conclusion.
Inga, you're well out of this!
And in the back of a real theater, we see that Helga has stolen and claimed ownership of the play Deathtrap, which ends presumably how the true story did. Amusingly, she's still wearing her night jogging reflector hat to the premiere of her first Broadway play. The actual set on the stage is the real Deathtrap set because it was still playing at the Music Box Theater when the film was produced. Isn't that great?
That's nice.
Yeah, I think that was such a cool touch. I wish it could have been the actual cast. I don't think it was, but I'm not certain that it wasn't. The producer, Seymour Starger, gives Helga a big hug for the incredibly successful play they've created together. The camera backs out the door, following the satisfied audience onto the street, and then tilts up to the Music Box billboard for Helga Tendorp's Deathtrap. I kind of wish that billboard had been the billboard that ran during the show, because it'd be like, oh, who's Helga Tendorp? And then at the end you realize, oh, that's the character. We're implying that she wrote it when she clearly didn't. The end. That's Deathtrap, everybody.
It's good.
Yeah.
I liked it.
I really enjoyed it. It gets compared a lot to Sleuth.
Yeah,
Sleuth is better though.
Yeah,
I think Sleuth
is way better. But because I think this movie loses me. Like I agree with you.
The psychic stuff.
The psychic stuff kind of like is like, and then just this kind of like ending was a little unsatisfying to me.
Yeah.
I guess I just wanted a little bit more of a finale.
Yeah, I think the Helga Tendorp character is kind of a Marple stand-in because she's supposed to be someone who's not an official authority figure like law enforcement officer, but someone who's able to come in and tell you a bunch of stuff about a scene. But I think that's so much more interesting when the person is using clues from the area. And if they're just saying, I feel like you're going to have a heart attack later, it's like, that's crazy. You knew that. And it's like, it's not crazy because you just put it in her mouth. You just pushed it into her mouth. She didn't come up with that.
Well, and I thought it was going to be an obstacle. Like, oh man, she's really good at predicting things.
Sure.
We're going to have to, our clever plan is going to have to include her predictions.
Oh, okay.
In order
use them against her or something.
Yeah, we have to satisfy her predictions in order for this to all come to a conclusion.
Yeah.
Because the knife never gets.
Well, that's what bothers me is she does say the knife will be used again by another woman.
Yeah.
Not in a play, but because of one, and she never gets it away from him on the floor. And we see in the stage play performance of Deathtrap, when we cut to it at the end, that Clifford is using the knife to stab Sidney in the back, but it's not her using the knife, which I thought was a weird choice.
Because they also establish that she was on the Merv Griffin show and was bad, like it was a bad show.
I guess she just told shitty fortunes or something.
Yeah, and so it was like, I don't know what we're doing with this character.
Yeah. But I do like most of what's going on here, and I love the meta bits of the play within the play and the characters reacting to what I'm like, well, wouldn't that imply this? And then the character's like, well, wouldn't that imply this? Like they're worried about the same things that how I'm trying to like logic it together. But yeah, and obviously the performances from Christopher Reeve and Michael Caine are great here. I did rewatch Sleuth, which if you haven't seen it is really wonderful. Basically, you have the first one came out in 1972. It was Laurence Olivier and Michael Caine. Laurence Olivier is like a mystery writer, kind of like the character that Christopher Plummer is playing in Knives Out. That he's been a mystery writer for years. He has all these books. He has a house full of toys and games, and he just likes making little traps for people. And so he invites out the fiance of his ex-wife, or maybe they're still married and he's here to like urge him to sign the divorce paperwork. Either way, he invites his ex-lover's new lover to his castle, and basically they're in a game of cat and mouse, and then at the halfway point things switch and suddenly the person who's being pursued is now the pursuer. And it's really interesting and smart, and a lot of great dialogue with just two characters. Like, you never see anybody else in the whole movie, which is really interesting. And then they remade that in 2006. Have you ever seen that? The 2006
I have
Sleuth?
not.
So Michael Caine is back. He's playing the Laurence Olivier half. And you have Jude Law is the younger guy. And he's coming for the same reason. He's the new lover of the ex-lover.
Mm-hmm.
But the age difference in the first film is 26 years. It's 42 years
Yeah.
in the second one,
It's a
which
lot.
is a little
Yeah.
weird that they would be fighting over the same woman. And it's not a direct remake because it was rewritten pretty extensively by Harold Pinter. So it has a lot of curse words in it. It has, like, the whole second half of the movie has very expressly laid out gay undertones between the two characters. Like, the men are like, one of them convinces the other one that they could live a life together and forget about this woman, which is not a part at all in the first Sleuth. So it almost kind of feels like a combination of Sleuth and Deathtrap, the way they did the remake. And then obviously we talked about Knives Out already, how so much of the Thrombly character, or whatever his name was, but it feels like the Sleuth house, but then there's a lot of Deathtrap in it too.
It was at first a criticism that the movie felt like a play.
Yeah.
But I was like, I think that's actually intentional.
Yeah.
It's because there's a couple of these like really big monologues. You know, Michael Caine's initial monologue about how he's written out and is pacing back and forth and saying, it's like, this feels like I'm watching an actor on a stage. And then when Clifford's there, Myra's rant about how she should be working with Sidney,
right,
and give him credit, and you don't understand. And I was like, this also feels like a play. But and then the end, I looked back and I'm like, I guess that was intentional, but it felt odd at the time.
Sure. But yeah, I would definitely give this a thumbs up.
Oh yeah, it's a thumbs up.
It's a thumbs up.
Do we know what we're doing with this one, Letterboxd?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't as good as Sleuth, but it's a lot better than most of the movies we've watched this year.
That's true.
I actually have it in number 3 for the year.
Oh, wow.
Well, it's better than most of these movies.
No, I don't disagree.
It's below Das Boot and above Butcher, Baker, Nightmare Maker.
All right. Richard?
I have it in 13th, which puts it below The Border and above Splits.
I have it exactly between you guys in 8th. That's directly under Evil Under the Sun and just above Quest for Fire. Our director here was Sidney Lumet. Before this, he'd directed 12 Angry Men, Long Day's Journey into Night, Fail Safe, Bye Bye Braverman, The Anderson Tapes, Murder on the Orient Express, Dog Day Afternoon, Network, Equus, and so far on the show, The Wiz, Just Tell Me What You Want, and Prince of the City. He's back later this season with The Verdict, and later a Gloria remake, Find Me Guilty, and Before the Devil Knows You're Dead. The play was written by Ira Levin, and this is sort of based on a draft that he did that was rewritten by J. Presson Allen. He had previously written the novel adapted into 1956's A Kiss Before Dying and an episode of Hitchcock Presents. He also wrote the novels adapted into The Stepford Wives and Rosemary's Baby. So far on the show, he's written The Boys from Brazil. Other credits include mostly remakes of titles I already mentioned, and of course, he's also Tony nominated for Best Play for Deathtrap's Broadway run, and he's also a 3-time Edgar Allan Poe Award winner, an annual prize for mystery writers, after his novel A Kiss Before Dying, this play, and then a 2003 award for his overall contribution to the genre. The other screenwriter credit goes to J. Presson Allen. Before this, she wrote the screenplays of Hitchcock's Marnie, Cabaret, Funny Lady, and so far on the show, previous Lumet titles, Just Tell Me What You Want and Prince of the City. We've also seen her name with an exec producer credit on It's My Turn in 1980, and she reteams with Lumet for The Verdict later this season. The music here came from Johnny Mandel. He has earlier composer credits in The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming, and MASH's theme song, Suicide is Painless, with lyrics famously provided by the director's son Mike Altman. Mandel has later credits in 1941, Being There, Fame, Staying Alive, The Shadow, It Could Happen to You, and Swingers. The cinematographer here was Andrzej Bartkowiak. He would later go on to direct Romeo Must Die, Exit Wounds, the 2005 Doom, and Street Fighter: The Legend of Chun-Li. He has DP credits on Prince of the City before this, and later The Verdict, Terms of Endearment, Prizzi's Honor, Twins, Falling Down, Species, Jade, Dante's Peak, Devil's Advocate, and Lethal Weapon 4. Editor credit here for Jack Fitzstevens. He previously cut Just Tell Me What You Want and Prince of the City, and later this season Fighting Back. After that, his credits are mostly sound department. Michael Caine played Sidney Bruhl. He was born Maurice Micklewhite. Before this, he'd appeared as Lieutenant Bromhead. He's Harry Palmer in the Ipcris file. He's Alfie in Alfie. We've technically reviewed a small part of his 1966 film Funeral in Berlin when it was recycled into a MacGyver episode, and a larger chunk of the original Italian Job when it was recycled into another MacGyver episode. He's Carter in Get Carter. In 1972, he earned a Best Actor nomination starring opposite Sir Laurence Olivier in the original Sleuth, a film which this one is often and deservedly compared to, and he came back to portray Olivier's part in the 2007 remake opposite fellow Alfie, Jude Law, who plays Alfie in the Alfie remake.
That's right.
We at Vintage Video have made no excuses for our love of what Micklewhite considers his paycheck phase, which kicked off in '78 with Irwin Allen's Killer Bee disaster movie The Swarm, and continued through Beyond the Poseidon Adventure, Jaws the Revenge, and so far on the show, The Island and The Hand. We've also seen him in Dress to Kill and this, Deathtrap. Later he shows up in Blame It on Rio, Hannah and Her Sisters, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, and The Muppets Christmas Carol. He shows up in the Get Carter remake as Cliff Brumby opposite Stallone as Carter, with whom he had co-starred in Victory, aka Escape to Victory. Spoiler alert, he shows up in Goldmember as the father of both Austin and Douglas Powers, aka Dr. Evil. To modern audiences, he might first be recognized as the Alfred of the Chris Nolan Batman trilogy, and he has roles in many Nolan films of the time: The Prestige, Inception, Interstellar, Dunkirk, and Tenet. He has since retired, hence his absence from last year's Best Picture winner Nolan's Oppenheimer. Deathtrap was Caine's only film for Sidney Lumet, though he was briefly attached to Lumet's 1965 film The Hill and had to abandon that project to accept the part of Alfie in Alfie. Lumet, of course, forgave him for stepping away, and they later became good friends. Christopher Reeve was Clifford Anderson. Just prior to Deathtrap, Reeve had rocketed to fame from relative obscurity as the star of Richard Donner's Superman, and then appearing here as the lover of Batman's manservant.
The ultimate revenge against Batman.
Amusingly, for the 1979 national tour of Deathtrap, the Clifford role was played by Kevin Conroy, who would famously go on to voice Batman in many animated iterations. We've seen Reeve so far as another celebrated playwright in the classic time travel romance Somewhere in Time, and in the second Superman film. He's back this season in Monsignor, and again next season for another Superman film. In 1992, he reunited with Michael Caine for another story in the theater world entitled Noises Off. After a fourth Superman film in the late 80s for Canon, he transitioned to mostly TV series and TV movies, until in 1995 he was famously paralyzed from the neck down after tumbling forward off a horse, landing on his head, and shattering his first and second vertebrae. In his early career, Reeve had campaigned for environmental and human rights causes, and even led a protest in Chile against newly installed dictator Augusto Pinochet when he threatened the execution of 77 actors in the region. Just prior to his accident, Reeve was elected president of the Creative Coalition, a collective of liberal-minded celebrities using their influence to effect change in politics. He was even urged to consider a congressional campaign, to which he reportedly replied, "Run for Congress and lose my influence in Washington?" It's weird to think that if it hadn't been for his accident, Reeve might have gone on to be the Democratic answer to Reagan with a path to the presidency. Understandably, his post-accident activism was focused on advancing the treatment of spinal cord injuries. He pushed legislation to increase lifetime CPAs on insurance payments. Apparently, at the time of his accident, insurance companies would only pay out $1 million per person, and after that, the provider would close accounts, and anything over $1 million was out of pocket again. For everyone.
What?
Reeve's bill would have raised the cap to $10 million, but the bill was unfortunately defeated. But in the time since, such caps have been fully outlawed. But that's crazy that they'd just be like, we'll pay the first $1 million and you pay the other $10 million. And it's like, okay, then I don't want insurance. Goodbye.
Yeah.
He famously lobbied for the expanded funding of embryonic stem cell research, which was memorably lampooned on South Park, wherein stem cell research was portrayed as an exaggerated version of the propaganda of its political opponents, with infants being cracked open at the neck so Reeve could drink their spinal fluid and recover incrementally from his injuries, eventually transforming fully into the Superman character of his 80s film career. He returned to the DC universe for his final IMDb credit as Dr. Virgil Swan in a pair of Smallville episodes.
Mm-hmm. Margot Kidder also appeared in Smallville.
And I think a CG version of Christopher Reeve just appeared in that terrible Flash movie.
There was that weird commercial where they show him walking.
Did they really?
I think it might have been a
Was
Super
he still
Bowl.
alive at the time?
Yeah. It might have been a Super Bowl ad, but it was supposed to be like about medical science and things like that, and it's like him in the wheelchair, but he stands up and walks.
Did it look like Montalban on the moon or whatever the fuck?
Yeah, it looked
the Spy Kids movie.
It looked pretty awful. Like his head just didn't move right.
Weird. Dyan Cannon played Myra Bruhl. Before this, she starred in 1965's The Murder Game. She was the titular Alice in Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. She's in the Anderson tapes, Seamus, The Last of Sheila, Heaven Can Wait, and we've seen her now in Honeysuckle Rose and Coast to Coast. She's back this season for Author, and later as herself in She's Having a Baby, Caddyshack 2, 8 Heads in a Duffel Bag, Out to Sea. She was a judge on Ally McBeal, and just last year, she executive produced TV miniseries Archie, The Man Who Became Cary Grant, adapted from Cannon's own book detailing her brief marriage to Grant in the late 60s. She was nominated for a Razzie for this part, but the award went to Eileen Quinn for the lead role in Annie. Irene Worth played Helga Tendorp. Before this, she appeared in King Lear, Nicholas and Alexandra, and so far on the show as Mrs. Sokolow, mother of Sigourney Weaver in Eyewitness. The last name Tendorp is an anagram for portend, meaning to predict some momentous future event. Henry Jones played Porter Milgrim, totally pointless character.
It exists to point out something that
someone could have noticed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Before this, he was in The Bad Seed, The Girl Can't Help It, The OG 310 to Yuma, Vertigo, Support Your Local Sheriff, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and so far on the show, Dirty Dingus McGee and 9 to 5. He also famously shows up as Papa Chuck Banning, mob boss of MacGyver episode The Eraser. Later, he's in Dick Tracy, Arachnophobia, and The Grifters. Joe Silver played Seymour Starger. Before this, he's in Clute, Rhinoceros, The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz, and Shivers. After this, he's Arnold Hooper, younger brother of Mr. Hooper, and a few Sesame Street episodes. He also puts this fantastic deep voice to use as the voice of the Creep in 1987's Creep Show 2. So he's that weird Crypt Keeper type monster that tells you all the stories. Tony DiBenedetto played Burt the bartender. We've seen him so far in Windows, Defiance, The Exterminator, Fort Apache, The Bronx, Prince of the City, and Paternity. He's back this season as yet another Alfie in My Favorite Year. Later, he's in Splash, The Pope of Greenwich Village, Raw Deal, My Blue Heaven, Lumet's Gloria remake, and his last credit, Analyze This. Stuart Klein played himself. He's a 3-time Emmy-winning theater critic for TV Channel 5 in New York. Jeffrey Lyons is another well-known television and film critic, spending most of his career at New York's NBC station. His son Ben Lyons also has some film criticism credits, and for a time he even took over hosting duties on Siskel and Ebert's At the Movies opposite fellow Benjamin and Nepo baby Ben Mankiewicz. But that was a very unpopular iteration of the show. I think it lasted less than a year because people were mad that Ben didn't seem to know what he was doing. Joel Siegel played the third theater critic as himself, another Emmy-winning film critic on ABC's Good Morning America for over 25 years. Jenny Lumet played Stage Newsboy. As the name would suggest, she is the daughter of the director, and this was her first feature film appearance. She made waves with a successful first script in Rachel Getting Married, and then different waves with her second writing credit, providing the screen story for the Tom Cruise Mummy. Since then, she has leaned into her own personal Star Trek fandom with credits on a pair of Star Trek short films, a consulting producer credit on Star Trek Picard, 5 episodes of Star Trek Discovery, and she is the creator of Star Trek New Worlds. She's also married to actor Bobby Cannavale.
Yeah.
George Peck played the other stage actor. We saw him last as Rick in Dawn of the Mummy. John Eric Hexum, uncredited as a theater audience member. I didn't see him in there, and I don't know how true this is. But John Eric Hexum's longest role was in 20 episodes of Voyagers in 1982. He might have gone longer in the lead role of Mac Harper on action-adventure series Cover Up opposite Scanners actress Jennifer O'Neill, except that Hexum is unfortunately best known nowadays for his accidental death on the set. During a break in production on the 7th episode of the show, Hexum was playing with a prop gun loaded with blanks and pantomiming a game of Russian roulette, spun the cylinder with a single round, put it to his temple, and pulled the trigger. While a blank cartridge doesn't utilize a projectile, it still involves a packet of gunpowder to replicate the sound and flash of a real gun. The resulting explosion broke loose a piece of Hexum's skull and sent it through his brain, and 6 days later he was declared brain dead at Beverly Hills Medical Center. Amazingly, after 80-some years of actors firing fake guns at each other, Hexum became the first fatality of a blank cartridge on a set. He was famously followed a decade later in '94 with the death of Bruce Lee's son Brandon Lee on the set of The Crow. As far as I can tell, it hasn't happened on another professional set since then, though, as Mike Judge's idiocracy quickly comes true, and the human race strives to newer depths of stupidity, something much dumber has happened. On October 21st, 2021, for the first time in over a century of filmmaking, a live gun loaded with real bullets was handed to an actor and declared safe, resulting directly in the death of another person on the set of an independent Western entitled Rust. The film's armorer, Hannah Gutierrez Reed, came by her position on the set by way of nepotism, following in the footsteps of her stepfather, famed exhibition shooter, armorer, and stuntman Thel Reed. It was only Gutierrez Reed's second film as set armorer, and already her second scandal. On her first film, also a Western, she had fired a weapon without warning, leading lead actor Nicolas Cage to walk off the set for a day. Now, you may be thinking, Nicolas Cage doesn't do a lot of Westerns, does he? Do you guys recall the last time we discussed how rarely Nicolas Cage does Westerns?
Was it when Carl was on the show?
In our review of The Boogans, our special guest screenwriter Carl Lucas was telling us about his latest film, The Old Way, which would be Cage's first ever Western. Turns out Carl Lucas may have written the only film to ever credit Hannah Gutierrez Reed as its armorer, unless, God forbid, Rust is eventually released, which seems to be the plan.
I mean, you can't not release it, right?
They didn't finish shooting it. They shouldn't go back and finish it. I feel like that's just be done. You guys screwed up. Gutierrez Reed prepped a safe full of guns for production use. It was her job to verify the safety of all weapons. Assistant director David Halls picked up the gun for the scene and handed it to lead actor Alec Baldwin, announcing it was a cold gun, meaning it presented no danger of firing. While the crew worked up the scene, Baldwin rehearsed a quick draw motion and fired a single live round from the supposedly cold gun past camera through the chest of cinematographer Helena Hutchins and beyond her into the shoulder of Joel Souza. Hutchins was airlifted to a hospital in Albuquerque where she was pronounced dead. In the years since, multiple investigations have led to the jailings of A.D. David Halls and Hannah Gutierrez Reed. All charges against Alec Baldwin were dismissed, though less than a week ago, the prosecutor filed for an appeal, so that might be going back to court. I think that's everything for Deathtrap.
I just have one last note on Deathtrap. I hate the poster.
It's a giant Rubik's Cube for some reason?
Yeah, and they're like peeking out of a Rubik's Cube.
That feels like it fits with Sleuth better because the whole living room is crowded with toys and stuff. It doesn't make sense here.
Like, I understand that they're, relating it to, I guess, like a puzzle or like everything keeps switching and swapping around, like, which characters are doing what to each other. But it just seems like anachronistic to the movie.
It makes it look like it's like a farce.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, look, they're coming out of a toy box kind of thing. Like,
well, I do think that there were many moments in this that were supposed to be read as comedy too. But what's weird is that it's not anachronistic in that 1982 was like the height of the popularity of the Rubik's Cube.
No, I get that.
But
like,
it still seems very weird that you would just like, it feels like just like a toy product placement in your poster.
I guess in when I say anachronistic, I mean nothing about this film shouts 1982 to me.
I agree. It feels like it was trying to be an early 70s thing.
It could have been a murder mystery from the 40s or the 50s or the 60s. It doesn't matter. It was
as long
timeless.
as plays and guns existed.
Right,
that's really the only limits.
Well, and also like the poster, like the tagline here is like the trap is set, and it shows the Rubik's Cube is like it's not a trap.
Yeah, it's literally a guy just wants to write a play, and the other guy doesn't want him to write the play. There's no trap.
So if you've seen I don't know if you've seen like these other posters here, like that's a little more sinister.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
it's
like that better.
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe a little too sinister.
And I know this isn't necessary to dig into, but aren't there easier ways to scare your wife into a heart attack than I'm going to say that you wrote a play and then I'm going to kill you and then you're going to come back as a zombie and scare her to death.
I feel
it's
like
couldn't you have just screamed at her in her sleep or something? Like, I don't understand why we had to go through all of this.
But I think the exact reason that I feel like the gay love story is important is because of that. Because why would you bring another person into this plot to begin with unless they were like your lover, right? Yeah. Otherwise, just do it yourself and then nobody knows. She had a heart attack. No one was home but me.
But she would be just as scared if they skipped the whole I have a student that wrote a script thing and he busted in the window and killed her husband in the bedroom and chased her down the stairs. She still would have had the heart attack.
Right?
So it just like, I mean, I get that the whole point is we're making a movie and we tell the story with a bunch of characters, but it still seems like so much extra unnecessary work.
Because isn't that the plot of a movie? Like this guy's trying to scare, isn't that his
wife to death?
Yeah, isn't that the original plot of House on Haunted Hill? The Vincent Price that he's trying to scare. That sounds
right.
He's trying to scare her to death.
That's possible. It also reminds me of that scene from. Have you seen Man Bites Dog?
No, I've not.
Well, there's a scene in that movie where he says he's going to interview this older woman, and he like invites himself into her apartment, and he's sitting with her on the couch, and suddenly he just like screams in her face and starts screaming in her ear so hard that she has a heart attack and dies. Mm-hmm. He's like, a lot of these people you don't even have to do anything, you just scream at them in this one, like a few seconds of screaming and they're just out and they're done. And then he's like going around the house showing where old people always hide their money and just collecting all of her money and leaves. It's fucking crazy.
Haunted Honeymoon is also another plot where they're trying to intentionally scare
someone to
Gene
death.
Wilder.
Yeah.
Have you seen Haunted Honeymoon?
I don't think I have.
Oh man, it's great. It's Gene Wilder, Gilda Radner, Jonathan Pryce.
You haven't seen that movie?
Jeff Goldblum, I think, or is that Transylvania 65000?
That's Transylvania.
This is older than that, I think.
Yeah.
This is so great. Did we not watch this together? I'm pretty sure we all watched this together.
I feel like we have. Yeah.
We definitely
We definitely watched it as a group because I remember you bringing it in. I'm like, oh, I love this movie. Oh, you've seen it. Patrick hasn't. And then we watched it.
Why did you guys watch it without me? I think that's everything for Deathtrap. If you have any thoughts you'd like to share, you can find all our socials at linktree/vintagevideopod. If you enjoy what we're doing, consider giving us a review on iTunes. I don't think it helps visibility, but it's good for morale. And if you really like the show, maybe you should join our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/vintagevideopodcast for access to all our monthly 70s reviews and a hand in choosing next month's film. What's that sound?
We got one!
That's right, it's a new patron, Perry Llewellyn. As a $5 patron of the show, Perry now has access to 56 full-size 70s reviews and a hand in choosing next month's film. Patrons are currently choosing between Blood for Dracula, aka Andy Warhol's Dracula, Paul Morrissey's horror title, which, like Andy Warhol's Frankenstein before it, did not involve Warhol directly at all. It tells the story of an aging Dracula seeking a virgin bride. It stars Udo Kier as Count Dracula, Joe D'Alessandro, Vittorio De Sica, and Maxime McKendry. Confessions of a Window Cleaner, Val Guest's British sex comedy about a window cleaner who makes regular encounters with the unsatisfied housewives he spies on in the course of his work. It stars Robin Asquith, Anthony Booth, and Sheila White. Earthquake, Mark Robson's star-studded disaster film about a massive 9.9 earthquake demolishing the city of Los Angeles. It stars Charlton Heston, Ava Gardner, George Kennedy, Genevieve Bujold, Richard Roundtree, and Walter Matthau. The Klansman, Terrence Young's American drama based on William Bradford Huey's novel of the same name about an Alabama sheriff caught in the middle of overwhelming racial tensions in the wake of a local rape case. It stars Lee Marvin, Richard Burton, David Huddleston, Linda Evans, and O.J. Simpson. Lenny, Bob Fosse's Lenny Bruce biopic based on the play by Julian Barry. It stars Dustin Hoffman as Lenny, Valerie Perrine, and Jan Miner. The Little Prince, Stanley Donen's fantasy musical adaptation of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's novella about a pilot stranded in the desert where he meets and befriends a young prince. It stars Stephen Warner, Joss Ackland, Richard Kiley, Gene Wilder, and Lenny director Bob Fosse. Murder on the Orient Express, Sidney Lumet's adaptation of Agatha Christie's murder mystery novel, Murder on the Orient Express, about a mysterious death on a train and a handful of viable suspects. It stars Albert Finney, Lauren Bacall, Martin Balsam, Ingrid Bergman, Jacqueline Bisset, Sean Connery, and John Gielgud, among many others. Phantom of the Paradise. Brian De Palma's rock comedy musical about an up-and-coming rock star tricked into a Faustian bargain and giving up his music to a predatory record producer. It stars William Finley, Paul Williams, Jessica Harper, and Garrett Graham. The Street Fighter. Shigehiro Ozawa's Japanese martial arts film about a mercenary protecting the bereaved daughter of an oil baron from outside forces looking to strip her of her inheritance. It stars Sonny Chiba, Yutaka Nakajima, Chiyoko Kazama, and Etsuko Shigomi. Or A Woman Under the Influence. John Cassavetes' American drama about a woman's struggle with mental illness and alcoholism and its effect on her family. It stars Peter Falk, Gina Rollins, and Fred Draper, for a 50th anniversary review next month. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll join us next time when we'll be discussing Porky's, which IMDb describes like so. In 1954, a group of Florida high school guys try to help their buddy lose his virginity, which leads them to seek revenge on a sleazy nightclub owner and his redneck sheriff brother for harassing them. We leave you now with the trailer for Porky's.
20th Century Fox would like to introduce you to Pee-wee and his pals.
Speaking of horny mother.
Tommy, Mickey, Tim,
I'm going tonight, right? I don't know.
and the biggest man on campus.
Why do they call you meat? Because you're so big?
When they're not in class, they're into everything.
Save your energy, you're gonna need it.
Okay.
Okay, pull over.
Coast is clear. But what they'd like to get into most is a place called Porky's.
I left my idea. Here, use this one. That's my Bible school card.
Unfortunately, we can only show you the outside of Porky's, because what goes on inside is not to be believed.
Boy, the locker room. Oh, it's turned me on.
We'd like to show you more of the locker room, but this kind of physical education just isn't taught. We can't show you more of the shower scene, because what they're looking at isn't watered down.
They want us to look. They want us to look.
Porky's. You too will be back for a second look.